Before the first Norse ships set sail to raid European monasteries, before the word Viking existed in any historian's vocabulary, a group of men in Japan was already building temples with a technique so precise that 1400 years later, it still works exactly the same way. The year is 578 AD. In Europe, Germanic tribes are fighting bloody wars over the remains of the Roman Empire. In Arabia, an 8-year-old boy named Muhammad is growing up in Mecca, with no idea what the future holds. And on the other side of the world, on an archipelago surrounded by sea, a Japanese prince named Shotoku Taisho is about to make a decision that would change the history of architecture forever. He wants to build Japan's first Buddhist temple. There's just one problem. No one in the country knows how to do it. At that time, Japan was predominantly Shinto. Buddhist architecture, coming from China and Korea, required carpentry techniques that simply didn't exist on the Japanese islands. So the prince did what any smart leader would do. He went to find people who knew how. He invited 3 master carpenters from the Kingdom of Beech, on the Korean peninsula, to cross the sea and teach Japan the art of building temples. One of those 3 men was named Kongo Shigemitsu, and what he brought with him wasn't just a skill. It was the birth of an entire profession, a profession that survives intact to this day. It's called Myadeku. In English, it would roughly translate to shrine and temple carpenter. But that translation oversimplifies one of the most sophisticated forms of manual craftsmanship humanity has ever created. Here's what makes this profession different from any other you've ever heard of. The Myadeku builds temples and shrines without using a single nail. None. Zero. Every piece of wood is carved to fit perfectly into another through a joinery system called kigumi. The beams cross, lock, and support each other through geometric cuts calculated down to the millimeter, many of them invisible once assembled. Think about that for a second. We live in an age obsessed with screws, industrial glues, metal reinforcements, all to make sure a structure doesn't collapse. And there's a tradition, more than 1400 years old, of construction that dispenses with all of that entirely. Not because they didn't know how to use those things, but because wood carved the right way doesn't need them. And the result isn't just aesthetic. It's functional in a way that modern engineering has only recently started to understand. Japan is one of the most seismically active countries on the planet. Earthquakes have been part of life there for millennia. And the temples built by the Myadeku, without a single nail, withstand those tremors in a way rigid structures simply can't. Because when the earth shakes, carved wood has a slight ability to move, to absorb the impact, to give a little without breaking. Its structural flexibility conceived centuries before that concept became an engineering school topic. And it's not theory. It's a fact proven by time. The temple Kongo Shigemitsu helped build is called Shitenno-ji in Osaka. It was completed in 593. It's been destroyed by fires, by wars, by a typhoon that knocked down its 5-story pagoda in 1934. And every time, it was rebuilt using the same techniques, by the same lineage of carpenters. Because the structure was designed from the start to be taken apart and reassembled. The pieces can be removed, replaced, refitted. A building conceived not to last forever without maintenance, but to be perpetually restorable. That completely changes how you should think about construction. We live in a culture that treats buildings like disposable products. Build, use, decay, demolish, build again. The Myadeku thought the opposite way back in the 6th century. They didn't build a temple to last 1400 years without intervention. They built a system that lets the temple be renewed, piece by piece, generation after generation, without ever losing its original identity. And here's the part that might be the most impressive of all. Kongo Shigemitsu's family turned this knowledge into a company. It was called Kongo Gumi, and it operated continuously, always led by the same family line, for more than 1400 years. That's not a figure of speech. It's a documented historical fact. A scroll from the 17th century, more than 3 meters long, traces 40 generations of the company's leaders, one after another, going all the way back to the year 578. 40 generations. Think about what that means. While entire empires rose and collapsed, while Europe went through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, revolutions, world wars, that same Japanese family kept training carpenters, carving wood, raising temples, exactly as they'd been taught by the first masters who came from Korea. Kongo Gumi took part in building Osaka Castle in the 16th century, one of Japan's most iconic structures. It survived the persecution of Buddhism during the Meiji Restoration, when the government tried to suppress the religion and the work dried up overnight. It survived World War II, when demand for temples nearly disappeared and the company had to reinvent itself, literally, making coffins to get through the period. It even survived a suicide. During the economic depression of the early 20th century, the 37th head of the family took his own life under financial pressure. And it was his widow, Yoshi Kongo, who took over. The first woman, in 13 centuries of unbroken male leadership, to run the company. She reformed the administrative structure, separated the role of manager from the role of craftsman, and kept the legacy alive at the very moment it nearly disappeared for good. That's a level of resilience most modern companies don't even come close to understanding. But what finally brought down this dynasty wasn't war, or earthquake, or fire. It was debt. During Japan's real estate bubble of the 1980s, the company expanded beyond its traditional core, taking on heavy loans to invest in general construction and real estate. When the bubble burst in the 1990s, that debt became an impossible weight to carry. At the same time, donations to Buddhist temples kept declining, and demand for the company's original work dropped too. In 2006, after 1,429 years of independent operation, Kongo Gumi was absorbed as a subsidiary of the Takamatsu Construction Group. The name that had led more than 40 generations of the same family stopped controlling its own destiny. But here's the detail most people leave out when they tell this story, as if it were a sad ending. The company didn't die. It's still operating today, under the same name, building and restoring Buddhist temples using the same ancestral techniques. The carpenters still gather, on the 1st and 15th of every month, for a small ceremony in memory of Prince Shotoku, the man who started it all by inviting 3 foreigners to teach an art Japan didn't yet know. The profession outlived the company. And that's what really matters here. Because Myadeku isn't just a job or a trade. It's a lineage of knowledge passed from master to apprentice, generation after generation, with almost no change to the essence of the technique. A young person who decides to follow this path today still spends about 10 years just learning the basics. Another 10 years to become a true master. He learns to choose the right wood, understanding how each tree reacts to humidity, to heat, to time. He learns to read the grain of the material before making a single cut. He learns hand tools that have practically vanished from the rest of the industrialized world. And the most striking part is that this training was never purely technical. One of the old heads of the Kongo family put in writing, back in the Meiji period, a set of 16 precepts to guide the company's future carpenters. That document doesn't just talk about quality of work or customer satisfaction. It talks about dressing according to one's own rank, about drinking in moderation, about treating people with absolute respect. The first article of that code states that following the principles of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Shinto, and training in the use of the carpenter's ruler, are the most important duties of all. In other words, for this tradition, learning to build a temple was never separate from learning to live with integrity. The wooden ruler and the character of the man holding it were literally measured by the same standard. That's something we've lost in almost every modern profession. The idea that mastering a craft takes time, patience, and character formation, not just accumulated hours of practice. Today we want to learn anything in 30 days through an online course. And there's nothing wrong with wanting speed. But it's worth stopping to look at a tradition that decided 1,400 years ago that certain things simply can't be rushed. And there's another technical detail worth highlighting, because it connects this Japanese profession directly to something that still fascinates engineers today. The Horyuji Temple, in the city of Nara, contains some of the oldest wooden elements in the world still standing, roughly 1,300 years old. That's older than most of Europe's stone cathedrals. And it's wood, a material that common intuition says should rot, sag, and collapse within a few decades without heavy maintenance. But the philosophy behind the Myadeki's construction was never to make an eternal, unchanging structure. It was to create a living system, capable of being cared for, replaced piece by piece, and so, paradoxically, made to last practically forever. This is sometimes called periodic reconstruction, and one of the most famous examples of it in Japan is the Ise Shrine, rebuilt from scratch, following the exact same design, every 20 years, for more than 1,300 years. Not because the previous structure was falling apart, but because this is how the ancient Japanese found a way to make sure the knowledge of how construction should never be lost. Each generation of carpenters literally has to rebuild the temple with their own hands to learn the technique in practice, and so pass it on to the next generation. Stop and think about what that represents. While most of human history tried to beat time by building things that were ever more durable, heavier, more resistant to the passing of centuries, a Japanese tradition decided to beat time in a different way. By accepting that everything wears down, and turning that constant rebuilding into the very mechanism of preservation. The building changes in substance, but the form, the knowledge, and the skill stay exactly the same. It's almost a perfect metaphor for what it means to keep a tradition alive. It's not about preserving the object at all costs. It's about preserving the ability to recreate that object whenever it's needed. And going back to the comparison that opened this video. While this profession was already raising temples without nails, ready to withstand earthquakes and last for centuries, the Vikings hadn't even set sail on their first recorded raids yet. The Viking Age, as most historians define it, officially begins in 793 AD with the attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in England. That's more than 200 years after Kongo Shigemitsu was already carving the first beams of Shitenno-ji in Osaka. 200 years. That's like comparing the time between American independence and today. And even so, this Japanese profession isn't just older. It's still being practiced, today, by men who learned from masters who learned from other masters, in an unbroken chain that traces directly back to the year 578. Today, there are still workshops scattered across Japan, training new Myadeku, many of them tied to the restoration of historic temples and Shinto shrines. It's a rare trade, increasingly hard to sustain economically, but one that stubbornly endures, just as it endured fires, earthquakes, wars, and economic crises across 14 centuries. And maybe that's the most valuable lesson in this entire story. It's not about wood or joinery technique or a centuries-old company that became a subsidiary of a bigger one. It's about what it means to build something meant to last longer than the life of the person who builds it. Something that doesn't depend on you being alive for it to keep existing, because the knowledge was passed on with patience, with discipline, and with a deep understanding that certain things really are worth the time they demand. While empires rose and fell, while the Vikings sailed and vanished from history, while the whole world transformed over and over again, a group of Japanese carpenters kept doing, with their hands, exactly what the first Korean masters taught in a temple in Osaka in the year 578. And that's exactly why this profession isn't just old. It's living proof that there are forms of knowledge capable of crossing time intact, as long as someone, generation after generation, is willing to carry them forward.